Welcome. Thanks for your attention today. I'd like to spend just a few minutes giving a brief overview of how AtScale works with Snowflake to help improve your BI reporting and analytics applications on large sets of data, obviously in the Snowflake platform. I'm going to have a very short presentation of PowerPoint here just to kind of set things up. So we're not going to spend too much time here. Obviously, you can see a lot of different industries and markets that we work with, a lot of the largest companies in the world. The point here is just simply that there's nothing that's industry or market specific about AtScale. We're looking for BI workloads. So if you're doing reporting and analytics, it's probably something we can help with, regardless of what kind of market industry you happen to be in. Now, in AtScale, obviously there's a lot of sort of features and functions that are contained within the platform. What I'd like to do is kind of focus folks on a couple of the primary big ideas. What is really the point behind AtScale? What is it going to do for you that makes your life better? Now, the first of those big ideas tends to be the improvement of the scale and performance of your existing BI tools on your modern data platform. So obviously there's lots of great things about these modern data platforms today, obviously like Snowflake, and including just the ability to scale to truly limitless volumes of data. I mean, there's basically no limits whatsoever. We basically store all of the data that we ever produce these days, which of course is great, up until the point that we try to do analytics and reporting on that data, where now maybe our existing BI tools are having trouble with scale and performance on that data. If it takes my analysts, minutes or potentially hours to get an answer to a question they've asked, basically becomes impossible for them to do their jobs. So first and foremost, AtScale makes those existing BI tools scale to limitless volumes of data on Snowflake, while providing the kind of conversational response time that they need in order to effectively do their jobs. So that's that first big idea, and we'll talk through that a little bit more as we go through. The second big idea kind of comes down to the notions around coordination and governance. So if you kind of think about the traditional BI landscape over here on the left, where you've got folks using Power BI and Tableau and Excel, maybe Cognos Business Objects, so on and so forth. In the traditional motion, each of those tools might have its own proprietary semantic layer that you have to develop, might have their own data integration things that have to be done, might have their own security stuff you have to do, or maybe in some cases you find a tool that doesn't have any of those things, and now you're just completely dependent on the users just knowing what they're doing. Well, with AtScale, we kind of turn that whole process on its head. In AtScale, you do all of that work in one single place. You build that model in AtScale. So you do all of the design work, both in terms of what data you want your users to have access to and how it should be presented to them, as well as things like business rules and calculations, security constraints, all of that stuff in that one place. And you simply then attach whatever BI tools you happen to have to that AtScale universal semantic layer, and you're off and running without having to sort of recreate that wheel over and over again from one tool to the next, obviously potentially inadvertently changing something along the way so that your Excel spreadsheets don't tie out with your Tableau dashboards, etc. So that's really the second big idea behind AtScale. Those two concepts drive what AtScale is and what it's about. Now, we're not going to go too deep into the architecture. Obviously, we have a limited amount of time here. We're just trying to give a quick intro. But the basic notion is that you would have an instance of AtScale that might be just a single VM, depending on what you're up to. That's going to attach to your data in Snowflake, obviously. And the first step then is going to be to build an AtScale model. And we'll take a peek at that here in a second. That part of AtScale is modeled around the OLAP metaphor, which is a very intuitive way for both model developers to work with setting things up, as you'll see in a moment, as well as for end users to interact with their data. Kind of don't really care from the end user standpoint if what they're doing is something you would think of as OLAP or not. It's really just around that design phase. And when you have that model created with the data and the presentation, the business rules, the calcs, the governance rules that you need, you publish that, and that then becomes that universal semantic layer. And that's when you attach those BI tools to it. Now, it's important to note here that we support not just SQL-based tools. Like a classic example would be Tableau. Most folks tend to use Tableau in SQL mode to access and analyze their data. But we also support MDX-based tools. This kind of plays into the notion of a universal semantic layer. The classic example here is Excel. Everyone in the world has Excel, and advanced Excel analysts tend to like using pivot tables to do that kind of advanced data analysis in Excel. And that pivot table interface in Excel requires an MDX data source. And one of the things that's true about really all of our modern data sources these days, including Snowflake, it doesn't have an MDX interface natively. So if you needed to put an MDX-based tool like Excel and do those pivot tables on data in Snowflake, AtScale is actually the only way that you can get that done. So that's the kind of first part there, just very logically speaking, create that model, publish it out, and there's that universal semantic layer for users to get in there and start working. And that's one of those big ideas. Now, the second one, though, is still back to that scale and performance. So how do we actually improve the user's experience as they're working with that data in their BI tools? So you'll notice there's another box here towards the bottom of my diagram here for acceleration structures, or you might think of these as aggregates or AGs. We tend to think of them internally, kind of maybe analogous to a summary table, an old school data warehousing parlance. What we do is AtScale will watch what those users are doing as they interact with that universal semantic layer with a machine learning component built into the AtScale platform. And what that machine learning component does is it watches for the human signals of what your users are doing with their data, as they're creating queries over different combinations of dimensions and measures, they're filtering on things, they're sorting on things, etc. AtScale uses that intelligence about what your users are up to design and, of course, create and maintain net new data structures, these aggregates, these acceleration structures that are optimized to support the things that we see your users doing with your data. And that's a concept that we think of as autonomous data engineering. So the AtScale engine is actually doing that work for you now in automated response to your end user activity. And keep in mind that this is an adaptive process, right? So as time goes on, if your user behaviors change or you introduce some new data for them to work with, AtScale is constantly adapting and evolving those acceleration structures, those aggregates, to keep pace with what your users are doing. And just to be clear, at no time does the data actually have to get transported off of Snowflake. All of that information stays resident in Snowflake. We're not moving that away. It doesn't move to the AtScale platform or go anywhere else. All that data stays where you placed it in the Snowflake platform, with Snowflake performing all of the runtime functionality as AtScale governs from the platform. So that's basically the quick intro there to what AtScale is and what it does. Let's kind of take a peek at how this looks from the modeler standpoint and then from the end user standpoint. So just quickly, we've got a little modeler that we built up with some trading information. So this is a pretty simple model. There's not an awful lot here. Granted, in the real world, you may have very large models or very simple models. It's very much up to your environment. We actually have three different fact tables in play. There's a trades table here that has some measures on it. There's a position table. We're actually pulling some data off of a trader table that we needed measures from. And you can see a number of shared dimensions here. So things like my time dimension is a shared dimension across all of these measures or these fact tables. I have my exchange. I've got my trader dimension. So traders belong to different portfolio managers. And other things like actions might only relate to one specific table. So only trades relate to actions here in this case. Now, as I've gone through and I've set up this semantic layer here, so I've done a little bit of that modeling work. This is all drag and drop kind of stuff, but you'll have a little preview here of what you've created, just so you can kind of see how this is going to look to your end users when they connect to AtScale through their BI tools and start to work with it. So let's take a look at what that looks like from an end user standpoint. So I'm going to start with Excel. Granted that we're kind of focused on financial data today. That's maybe a bit of a stereotype, but a lot of times you'll see those folks doing that analysis work in Excel. So what we see here is a pivot table in Excel connected to that model. And as you can see, if you're familiar with pivot tables in Excel, this is exactly like every other pivot table you've ever seen. If you've connected to analysis services, for example, and use this functionality, this is how it looks and works. So I've got all of my measures here. I've got my different dimensions. You can see there's my company profile dimension that goes from sector to industry to company name. Have some attributes there if I wanted to see, who's the CEO, what's their ticker symbol, etc. All of those things set up here in this little display that I've set up, currently showing 10 years of trading data, all of my portfolio managers, every trader that exists within all of those portfolio managers. So kind of an almost ridiculous amount of data here related through this spreadsheet. Keep in mind on the back end, this data set is actually nearly 11 billion rows of data. So as you see us work through this information today, kind of keep back in your mind that scale and performance improvement that scale does through that autonomous data engineering we talked about, and see how that affects their performance on this data set of many billions of rows of data. Now this is all well and good, but I kind of want to take a step back and show you how you actually create something like this. How do you actually connect to AtScale and do something like this? So let's take a quick peek at how you would do that. Now, once you've created a model and published it in AtScale, you will get this connection tab. And as you can see here, there's basic connection strings. So if you need to connect to AtScale via JDBC, via ODBC, or via MDX, basically there's your connection string and you're off and running. And obviously we have sort of hints and tips here for some of the more popular tools that we tend to run into all the time. In my case, I'm just going to copy that MDX string. I'm just going to jump back to Excel, and I'm just going to make a new spreadsheet. We'll do this completely from scratch. So in Excel, it's kind of interesting if you're familiar with these pivot tables. You're going to go and tell it where to get data from. And in this case, you actually tell it that the data is coming from analysis services. So this actually goes through the exact same interface that SQL Server Analysis Services does, for those of you that are familiar with that. When I log in, I'll be able to see all of the AtScale projects, all of the cubes within those projects that I have access to in the AtScale system. There's that cube that we were just looking at. I'll go ahead and just make a quick basic pivot table here. So here's all of my measures, all of my dimensions again. So let's go ahead and build something from scratch. So I'm going to get my P&L measure here to start with. So this is kind of a nonsense number at this point. That's my total profit and loss from everything that's ever happened. That certainly needs some context around it. Let's go ahead and get the trader dimension. So here's all of my portfolio managers for basically all of time for their profit and loss activity. Let's put a little more context in this. Let's go ahead and get the date dimension. And let's filter this down. Let's go find maybe a particular date. Let's go to last year. Let's go check out a particular day last year. We'll get September 1st. So there's all of my portfolio managers' activity, their P&L level at that particular day back last year. Now, maybe I really want to focus in on my most interesting portfolio managers. So I'm going to go ahead and do a filter on my portfolio managers and say I really only want to see the top 10. Obviously, they're by the profit and loss figure. I might go ahead and just sort this so I've got my largest to smallest. And then, of course, if I wanted to see, hey, who's the individual traders within each of those portfolio managers, boom, there's that information. And obviously, this is all happening basically instantaneously as I'm working with this data coming from, again, close to 11 billion rows of data. So that's just one quick example. I'm going to back up here. Let's do one more, and then we'll see what's actually happening in the background. So I'm going to pull these items back off. We'll do another one here quickly from scratch. Let's look at a totally different set of data. Let's go and look at our trades. So how many trades did we have? And here you can actually see there's that 10.7 billion trades is actually what we're tracking against here. I'm kind of curious to see how those happened by the different exchanges, what the actions were that happened on each of those exchanges. And once again, maybe just do a quick date filter so we have a little more context here, just looking at what we're doing. So look at 2019 here across all of that information. So there you can see there's, just billions of rows of transactions popping through in Excel through that pivot table interface with that conversational response time that, of course, is very conducive to the things that your users need to do. Now let's go and take a look more closely at what's actually happening on the back end. So in AtScale, I'm going to go and look at my queries tab. Now you can see here really everything that happens in AtScale. If we kind of look at the last few queries that came through, we can see they were submitted by admin, which is the user I logged into Excel as. Now when I open that up, you'll see that the inbound query is an MDX query. And naturally, as we discussed earlier, that's what those Excel pivot tables require. They need an MDX-based data source in order to talk to do that kind of analysis there in Excel. So we received this MDX query coming in, and then on the outbound side, you'll see that we've translated that through into SQL. And frequently you'll actually see multi-pass SQL just because of the way that we have to translate that from MDX into SQL for Snowflake to process those queries. Now you can see, the execution time on this query was 0.3 milliseconds. It took just a little bit more than that to actually pull the data back down to my system here locally. Again, keep in mind, this is 11 billion rows of data that we're working with. Now you'll notice here in the queries that you'll have these blue hyperlinked tables in them. There'll always be a list of them towards the bottom. Now these are those aggregates that I was talking about. And if we kind of just pick one of these and we'll go and look at its definition, you can see what's in those aggregates. You can kind of see what that AtScale autonomous data engineering has done for you. Now this particular aggregate has basically the intersection of my actions and my exchange and years. And I've got a couple measures in here, so the number of shares, the trade counter. Now this all boils down to actually only 99 rows. So really there's only 99 different intersections of actions and exchanges and years. So AtScale has seen query patterns come through where folks are kind of looking for that data, and it boiled those 11 billion rows of data down to that 99. You can see how many times that this has been utilized. Obviously this is a very new little system, so it's only been used 5 times, but it saves seconds per run. Now, in the real world, of course, that would be larger based on your real world data volumes and the complexity of your queries. Each time we're able to redirect a user's query to a given aggregate, it might save minutes or potentially even hours of actual compute time every time that those users' queries come through. And that's how we get to that scale and performance boost that we talked about earlier. All right, let's talk about a couple other things just quickly to get a couple other things out of the way. I'm going to pop up Power BI just so we can show another interface here. Now, Power BI happens to run through MDX on AtScale as well. So you'll see the same sorts of things happen there in the Queries tab. So I won't spend an awful lot of time there. But as you can see, that universal semantic layer presented through with the same measures, the same dimensions that we saw there in Excel. Now, what I am going to do and spend a little more time on is I'm going to flip over to Tableau. So as we can see here in Tableau, I've got a report here that I've already created. Got some filters on here. So I'm looking at basically every healthcare symbol in this case across every industry that exists for 10 years worth of months across that 11 billion rows of data that we were talking about. Now, naturally, I can change things up here if I wanted to look at maybe the financial services sector. Maybe I want to look at just some insurance companies. As you can see, I can obviously flip through, change these things up, working through that information and getting that conversational response time that I need. Now, let's take a look at what would happen if I wanted to create something new, kind of like you saw us do there in Excel. So let's work with this universal semantic layer in Tableau to start from scratch. And as you can see, there's all of my same dimensions and measures that we saw before, both in Excel and in Power BI. So I'm going to start just really basic. Let's get my profit and loss figure, which is kind of a crazy figure all by itself there. Let's go ahead and split that across just every trader that exists. So this is a bit of an eye test chart here, if you will, when this comes up. Going to show every trader that exists for all time on their profit and loss. Let's go ahead and filter that down a bit. We'll maybe look at just one particular month. Let's look at, say, November of last year. And maybe we want to really focus in on just a given portfolio manager. So I'll grab one of these portfolio managers here, do a quick sort perhaps, and there's basically a ranking of all of my traders within that portfolio manager for November of last year. Now, obviously, I built this on the P&L. If I wanted to go and get some other measures, obviously, I can go and do that. So basically, you have that capability within your BI tools where you already have your skills and you're used to working with to use them as you normally do and have the access to that universal semantic layer where everything is easily organized and useful for the end user, while getting that conversational response time that those users need in order to get their jobs done. Now, if I flip back to AtScale now and look at what's going on, from Tableau, you'll see that we are indeed receiving SQL. So before, when we looked at this page from Excel, we were seeing those MDX queries come in. Tableau is running through SQL against AtScale, which is generally the way that most folks use Tableau. They use it in SQL mode. And you can see, of course, those filters coming through as I requested. Obviously, still going against Snowflake. There's the outgoing queries happening there. And you can see, once again, these execution times being measured in milliseconds. Now, something that's important to keep in mind, in AtScale, we have the capability to designate multiple different warehouses to interface to Snowflake with. And we'll make sure that we use the right size warehouse for each given query. So for example, my small interactive end user queries, which are the ones that typically will hit those aggregates in total, those are going against an extra small warehouse that I had built in Snowflake, whereas my system queries, primarily those ag builds, which are really kind of the big job, that maybe only happens once a day, I'm sending to an extra large, and I actually have a medium here for the ones in between. And you can see that reflected in Snowflake. So if I go to Snowflake and look at my query activity coming through, you'll see that all of the activities that we've been doing so far today during this little demo have all been hitting that extra small warehouse. You can see these queries coming through. In this case, I'm tagging them with the query ID from AtScale, so it makes it easier to look at. I've even got the username that was used in the BI tool, so that you have that capability to see what's going on. All of this happening against that extra small warehouse with these sub-second response times on billions and billions of rows of data. And to that point, we've got customers obviously not stopping at billions, but even trillions of rows of transaction level data, getting this kind of conversational response time through their BI tools by using AtScale on that application to both improve the scale and performance and provide access to that data to all BI tools all at once through that single unified universal semantic layer. So that's what we had for you today. I do appreciate your time. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to your Snowflake account executives, and we'll arrange some time to talk to you more about how AtScale can help you in your Snowflake deployments. Thanks a lot.